Hello and welcome to IGPP's special series on NCII. Every meaningful conversation about solutions must begin with an honest understanding of the problem. And that is where we are beginning today with this discussion. Non-Consensual Intimate Imagery, or NCII, has evolved into one of the most urgent and rapidly expanding forms of digital harm in the platform era. What once perceived as isolated incidents of unauthorized image has transformed into a complex network and increasingly monetized ecosystem of abuse. The rise of generative AI and deepfake technologies had dramatically lowered the barriers to abuse. Harmful content can now be created within minutes, distributed anonymously, and amplified across digital platforms at a speed that legal, institutional, and governance systems are still struggling to address. The gap between the scale of harm and the systems meant to prevent and respond to it continues to widen. It is this widening gap between technological harm and institutional responses that IGPP's panel discussion series, Combating NCII in India, Risks, Gaps, and Solutions, seeks to examine. To join us for this important conversation, we have an exceptional panel of experts working across technology policy, online safety, research, law enforcement, and digital rights. To begin with, we have with us Ms. Smita Mitra, who is founder and managing director of LifeFutureSkills, wherein she works on public policy, law enforcement, digital safety, and child protection. With over 2 decades of experience in the development sector, she has worked extensively on online crime against children with Interpol as a criminal intelligence specialist and has advised on trust and safety practices for leading social media platforms. Then we have with us Ms. Karuna Nain, who is an old friend also, who is working in this area for almost 2 decades now. She has served as Global Safety Policy Director at Mitra, where she led efforts on child safety, women's safety, and suicide prevention for over a decade. She then founded StopNCII.org, a global initiative to combat non-consensual intimate images in partnership with UK-based charity SWGFL, where she currently serves on board of trustees. We have with us Mr. Siddharth Pillai, who leads digital safety research and advocacy at RATI Foundation, an organization working to address violence against women and children in both online and offline spaces. At RATI, he has conceptualized several important online safety initiatives, including Mary Trustline and the Ideal Internet Research Projects. We will be also joined in some time by Ms. Rohini Lakshane, who is a technologist, interdisciplinary researcher, and Wikimedian who focuses on intersection of technology, policy, and civil liberties. Her research spans issues including gender-based violence, access to knowledge, openness and diversity, and inclusion in technology spaces. Thank you so much, all of you. And I'm really glad that you could take time out for this discussion, which is an important topic. And we hope that, we could come out with something interesting with this project, which we are starting to work with. I just want to come to you, Karuna, first, with my first question. NCII has emerged as one of the most serious forms of digital harm in recent years. With the rapid rise of generative AI and deepfake tools, how the nature of NCII has changed in terms of scale, accessibility, and sophistication. Karuna, please.
Thank you, Manish. And first, just before I answer the question, thank you so much for having me here. I think this discussion couldn't be more timely. I'm sure people who are following the news know that this week, the United States has enforced the Take It Down Act. In the UK, there have been significant announcements regarding the use of matching technology to get ahead of this kind of harm. So there's a lot of global conversation happening on this harm. So super timely. So thank you for trying to dig in from the Indian perspective to find out what more we should be doing on the ground to help victims, but also to combat this horrific harm. So, Manish, you dated me. You said we are old friends. And then you said that, I've worked for 2 decades in this space. And when I think of NCII, we're talking about AI and we're talking about how this harm is changing or transitioning. But if we are really honest, all of us will remember that case, that really heartbreaking case, which was in a Delhi-based school where pictures were circulated in MMS, format. So it's not a new harm. This has been around for a really long time, image-based abuse. We're seeing different variations of it and different versions of it come out. What's really changed is how these technologies have become so democratized and they become so accessible that people are using them on the go, on the move. It used to take a lot if you were trying to generate an image like this, be it like a real image or a synthetic image. It used to take a lot more coordination or effort to do something like this. And now it's getting more accessible, more easy. And even the spread of these, just given where they are being shared, is changing. So I think that's what we're seeing shift. But in terms of the victim's perspective, it's as hard or devastating to have your image shared, where be it a real image, be it a synthetic image. The consequences of it can be as far-reaching and as devastating as always. So the harm itself hasn't shifted. It's the way that it's being perpetrated that we are seeing certain shifts on.
I think that's an important thing to note, like, how it is shifting in this manner, and particularly from victims' perspective. If you look at it, it becomes more difficult. Smita ji, I want to come to you. From a governance and victim support perspective, what are the most significant India-specific challenges in addressing NCII?
To begin with, thank you so much for having me here. And as rightly said by Karuna, a very timely panel discussion on a very pertinent issue. When we look at image-based abuse, it's not old. It's been going on. The internet penetration and how effortlessly the images can be used and abused has just become prolific, and it's unprecedented. So it's important that policymakers like us or subject matter experts like us work very closely with the government, because right now, besides the standard operating procedure, which was released in October 2025, and also the portals by the Ministry of Home Affairs, I don't see any such real collaboration of interdepartmental effort for investigation, for case analysis, for strengthening the law enforcement to identify the victim and also safeguarding the victim. I think with the advancement in technology, the investigators and the policymakers or even the governance machinery is always doing a catch-up. Because while there are tools which can be used and abused, often the governance machinery is not even aware how it is being utilized and what harm it is creating on the victim, whether it is a woman or a child or a person or a male or of any other gendered sexuality. World over, we are seeing that there are decisions, there are communications which are being undertaken between ministries and departments. And I feel India is on the path for this, but there's a long way to go.
It seems like, as Karuna mentioned in the beginning, the era of MMS, and then it's still like, yesterday's thing, but it's really almost 2 decades. We have not been able to overcome, and it has rather got more sophisticated. It has become more nuanced in that in its spread. Siddharth, I want to come to you. The recent controversies involving Grok and around generative AI tools have shown how easily explicit content can be generated with minimal safeguards. What responsibilities should AI developers and digital platforms bear when their technologies enable or amplify NCI-related harms? You are mute.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Thank you for getting, and featuring RATI on your platform. In response to your question, I would first like to thoda sa step back, and say that, severity of the content is not always equal to harm. For example, it need not be a nude. It can be a really sensitive family situation and a girl's very simple photograph with an ex-boyfriend that has actually much more damaging capability than the severity of abuse, right? And while, I think it's very easy for people to say that, AI has reduced the friction of creating nudes. I feel that, even if you're not creating nudes, right? Even if I sort of take a girl's picture, write simple text on it using a simple editing tool, label her as a sex worker, put her phone number underneath it, and circulate it on WhatsApp, that is actually also far more as damaging, and I've not used anything as expensive or sophisticated as an AI tool, right? So I feel here we need to sort of step back, and I feel here, I think, just to go back to what Karuna and Smita was saying, right? So it's an age-old problem. We are seeing a new version of it. And I think what Smita has also pointed out, we should not decouple the policy for tech from the policy for sexual violence, right? Now, in sexual violence, the harm is always predicated on things like consent, right? On things like, the participation, the agency of the victim, etc. But tech policy is always featuring on how severe the content is and how soon it should come down. So that only captures one dimension of the harm. The victim is going through so much more. The victim is experiencing a greater social vulnerability, which I think by decoupling the tech law from the gender violence law and devaluing the aspect of consent, which is where the greater harm lies, right? So I think what does AI do? AI makes it very easy for the user to disregard consent, right? At the level at which it is created, say, right now, earlier we would see threats, right? Because we run a helpline, right? So perpetrators would say, I have your nudes and I will leak it. Now the language of threat is, I will create your nudes and I'm going to leak it. Right? So, but what is happening here is the consent of the victim is absent, right? And I feel the policies and everything should focus on how do we preserve this sort of victim's consent, which will enable law enforcement and platforms, etc., to understand harms which are not so severe, right? If it's a completely nude photograph, it gets down sooner. But if it's a girl in full clothes, or if it's a girl in only a bikini, it actually gets down much slower, right? That's because we are focusing on the severity of content and not on the consent of the victim.
I think I am a little puzzled who I bring this question of the consent to. Smita ji or Karuna, who would like to answer this particular point? Because I agree with what Siddharth has said, that the problem is civil. It's only, I would say, the betterment of technology. But the major issue is about consent, is about why it is done, how it is done, which becomes more a problem of governance and a problem of, I would say, largely society. How do you Smita ji, do you want to come to that question?
I think it is definitely an issue of governance, but having said that, the administrators or the policy makers who are there to make these policies and make the decisions need to be trained, oriented, understood the entire plethora or the spectrum of the issue, which often happens in a very siloed vision, which we have seen in India. The law enforcement or the Ministry of Home Affairs interfacing with the IT and communications, interfacing with the Ministry of Women and Child Development often doesn't happen. Bringing them on board and explaining to them the entire spectrum of the harm and the fact that there's a consent which is involved, where there comes a power dynamics between creating this image, the victim perspective, the victim support angle, which can also be strengthened a lot. But in terms of the policymakers, often we fall short on bringing them onto the table and the interdepartmental coordination, rather than explaining to them, going one after the other, and then taking appointments with each one of them, talking to them about this, the severity of the problem. Often they're just policymakers and they're here to resolve the cases, but they wouldn't be able to resolve if they don't understand the larger spectrum and the entire gamut of the problem. So it's important for us to explain to them, bring them to the same table, and then find a solution together. Because as subject matter experts, we will be able to give them the right perspective, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Karuna, what Smita ji is kind of bringing out is about definitely the governance in one part is one part, but from a technological standpoint, are current content moderation and detection systems adequately equipped to identify and respond to these NCII, which are largely sometimes AI generated, and if not, what can be done?
That's a really good question, Manish. So I think I do want to also touch on what Sid said, but first let me answer your question. So in terms of where is the tech for detection and where is, because obviously we've talked about the fact that the creation of this content and the spread of this content, we're seeing tech really moving, at astronomical pace. So when it comes to actually being able to help detect or take down this content, different tech platforms are at different stages of the journey. There are some tech platforms who've been looking at this issue very seriously for over a decade because of the nature of their business. They saw this come to their homes a lot sooner and they were responsive to it, and they've developed multi-layered response systems to try and get ahead of it. They allow users to report this kind of content. They use image matching technology to stop it from being reshared, so the burden on the victim to keep reporting it is reduced. Some of them are using AI to proactively detect this content, because sometimes even victims don't know if this content is being shared in closed groups or private spaces. So they're using different tools and technologies to try and combat it. But then there are certain tech platforms who are now, because of the governments and the regulations which are being imposed on them, waking up to say, oh God, this is a problem which we need to get ahead of. So it really depends on who you're talking to in the industry as well. But, I think Sid has really hit on something which is very critical. From the South Asian perspective, a lot of the definition of NCII for these tech platforms is based on the, what academics and all have done work on. And these academics are usually sitting outside our borders, and they've talked about, images that are explicit, that are showing, nudity or near nudity. They're not really talking about this content from our perspective or from our context. So like, Sid said, if there's an innocent picture of a boy or a girl in a public space which violates our social norms but may not violate the platform's policies, but still puts that child at risk or in harm's way because her family will be horrified to see that content in the public domain, that puts the child's life at risk. But this wouldn't violate an NCII policy, because NCII focuses on nudity or near nudity. So a lot of work needs to be done around, educating platforms on what does this mean for our, context, but also on maybe there are other avenues where victims can report that kind of content to get it taken down. But the fact of the matter is, once that content is shared, the damage is done. So, a lot more education around consent, a lot more, we failed. We've clearly failed at, telling people that, why are you sharing this? This is not okay, that this shouldn't be done. So, Smita's talked a lot about the law enforcement response and all. It's critical because unless we make a few examples of cases where perpetrators have been held to account, people won't understand or realize that this is actually illegal. In the industry, one of the things that was a huge eye-opener for me was a lot of this content was actually celebrity content that was being shared, because people thought celebrities are fair game and, they put themselves out there for our entertainment, and therefore their near nude or nude content, let's just share it wildly. But even they have a right to privacy. So, we need to do a lot of education to tell people this is actually illegal. It's not okay to share this content online. And forget illegal, it's actually very harmful and hurts people. Why is it okay for you to hurt someone else? So we need to do a lot of grassroots level education and awareness building on this specific harm, especially.
So the question, I think it boils down to accountability and responsibility. And accountability and responsibility on both, definitely on people, but also on the part of the governance and other platforms. So that what should meaningful accountability look like in the practice in the case of NCII from both perspectives?
So I think the first thing, it's about like seeking redressal, right? And the foundational aspect of redressal is access. How accessible are systems, both on the platform and in, like if you want to go to your police thana, right? So for example, like on a certain platform, if you want to sort of like submit a thing to take off NCI, which is non-nude, you have to file a privacy complaint. Now, in that privacy complaint, the perpetrator is intimated that you've already sent a request, And the privacy complaint form is so tough that it requires a lawyer to fill up, right? Now, this client who came to our helpline, they knew only Malayalam. So I sent her the Malayalam form and she's like, you might as well have sent me the English form because this is a direct technical translation of the English to like a higher level Malayalam, which, is impossible for like a Malayalam graduate to crack, So at various levels, there are accessibility issues. And the same thing that is there on the, for example, like in India, a lot of kids are learning interrupted, but they're also on platforms. A lot of children are disabled, they're also on platforms. Now, if you're using your device through voice, how do you activate safety systems? Like should a disabled person or should a person who's not learning literate be unable to access accounts? So that is the Indian scenario, right? So are these forms or mechanisms that are available, are they accessible, should be the first point of contention. Then even in the police thana, right? Like if you've seen the recent NCRB figures, the last whole year, like in 2024, just 1,200 cases of child sexual abuse online. Just 7,000 cases of women, like it's so low, right? So clearly the cases are getting misregistered. They're not being, essentially, it really calls to like a crisis in access to justice and redressal, both online, on platforms, So we always give this advertisement, like if something bad happens to you, walk into the police station. But that's not the starting. That's the beginning of an entire process, So I feel like, people are also disempowered there. The systems are also not what we will call victim centric. So I think, like all round reformation and victim centricness needs to be introduced. Otherwise, people will be more comfortable, like sharing it with their friends and neighbors rather than with the system.
I think again, I think I'm just wondering during this discussion, how do you think about the society on it? I'm a sociologist by training, so I think I'm going on the different direction. But I want to come back to you, Smitaji. Is India institutionally prepared to respond to NCII? Where do you see the biggest gaps across law enforcement, regulation, and victim support? If we talk about it.
So I'll just carry it forward from Siddharth. He spoke about child-friendly and victim-centric. Let's also add the word trauma-informed. Often the police is also not sensitized enough to how to deal with these kind of cases. Sitting at Interpol, I could tell you that I have seen as much cases on India, and I would get very disturbed because I'm looking at the sensitive content and sending the intelligence to the investigation officers because I am seeing it and I'm hearing it. I would want them to be resolved. But let's look at it from the lens that when it has to be resolved, is the law enforcement empowered enough? Are they trained enough? Do they know how to use certain tools to do the investigations? They would have to coordinate with other departments. Are they empowered and enabled enough to do that? No, that takes a very, very long time. To quote an example, in Philippines, when we alerted the police on a certain case because we were witnessing it in the dark web in real time, it took them 9 months to go and to the place with a search warrant, and yet they rescued 19 girls. And I'm proud that they at least rescued 19 girls. To come back to India, while we say that technology has advanced and there is some level of awareness, but I wouldn't say it is adequate enough, because when the victim wants to go and file first information report or has to go to the police station, there's another plethora and another trauma that the victim and the victim's family has to go through. That has to be broken down, and it's going to take a while for that to happen. I do see a certain level of interdepartmental communication, but that communication, collaboration, and action has to happen, which has to be a roadmap informed by all of us, because we have seen what is happening globally in the region. We have also seen some of this sensitive content, and done the investigations on that. So we truly understand what the victim goes through. Because when you are investigating and when you're looking at sensitive content, you are equally involved and invested. And it's not just an image or a video for you, it's a real child, which we all understand. So I would just take it forward a little more victim centric, child rights perspective, trauma informed, but at the same time, the interdepartmental sensitization, coordination, bringing the right people on board. Most importantly, allocating the resources for something like this, because victim support we often see does not have adequate resources. So, yeah, I would rest my case there. Thank you.
I think that's very interesting because we need a kind of a wholesome and composite approach to this thing. Karuna, this brings me to you because you have been into different roles. You have now kind of jumped over from the role towards from the companies to more of civil society. How can governments, civil society organizations, and technology companies collaborate more effectively to strengthen prevention, detection, and rapid response mechanisms for NCII? You're mute.
Sorry, I did it this time. It's like we're going around the roulette, somebody forgets to unmute themselves. But I think both Smita and Sid, really touched on it. It has to be for putting the victim at the center of this question and, making sure that the burden on the victim is reduced as much as possible. Right from just from the platform perspective to reporting that content in an easy way, which is understandable, to making sure that that content isn't reshared, not having them stay up all night to keep refreshing the page. Kisi aur ne to nahi share kar diya, has someone else, put it out there. To, being able to, file a FIR and not be shamed. Why did you share your photograph in the first place? Like, you must have done something. So the whole, life cycle of, this needs a thoughtful review to make sure that it is, from a victim perspective, a much more accessible path, and it's not as insurmountable, which stops people from coming out to report. The statistics which Sid quoted from the NCPCR, like, in terms from the national data in terms of the number of reports which have been filed, both on the child, abuse content piece of it, but also on the adult NCII space piece of it. I think it's something which just tells you that victims aren't empowered to report or to get help when they need it, which is why a service like stopncii.org, we set it up, because that's the feedback we heard, not just from India, from everywhere in the world, that to get help in these situations is just really, really hard, because the first is the blame piece of it. You're blamed, you're shamed, and that really stops your ability to get help and support. So we need more and more platforms like stopnci.org with that 360-degree support built around them, which Sid and the RATI team, do, so that, victims can actually go out, get that content taken down so that they can sleep, they can get the help and support, that they can get the, law enforcement piece of it activated, and they can get justice if they want that, or if they wanted to just be put behind them and move on, they have that, ability to do that as adults. So I do think that it needs to be more victim informed and more trauma informed, as Smita rightly said.
I think you also again raised a very relevant thing, because as we have been talking about, police stations are one thing where we can go or not go as a question. But even with some website where you have only to go on the online, and what you have to do becomes a big challenge. Siddharth, you had been kind of running these kind of support systems. What are the biggest barriers victims face while reporting NCI related harms? And how can reporting and redressal systems become more survivable?
Right. So I think just look at the journey of a victim, right? So I think one of the big things that happens is that, like, a lot of safety messaging is like, if something bad happens, report and block. On some apps, the moment you press report, it sort of erases evidence. So I think we need to reframe that, like, block one of our prevention statement, which is if anything bad happens, keep evidence, take a screenshot, then later report, because that sort of, like, is a huge barrier on the victim, where even if they enter the police station, they have nothing to show. Even if they reach a helpline service, or they want to later escalate it to a grievance officer, there is nothing to show, right? So at a preventive system, this habit of, like, even in scams or anything, to take the screenshot is super important, right? Then the victim needs, we feel, about 4 to 5 types of services. The one major requested service is content takedown, as I think both the speakers have reflected. When the content is up, the victim is in a very emotionally heightened state. So how do we cater for this emotional isolation? We will have to connect them to a counselor. So all the calls that come into Mary Trustline are fielded directed by the counselor, because the victim reaches out always in a state of panic. They're unable to even say what happened to them in a linear way. So a counselor calms them down, and until the content is down, they sort of help them. Then of course they need good sound legal advice, right? So it's not easy. When you enter a police station, you might lose your phone. So to take backup, how do you submit digital evidence, etc. The victim has a huge role to play when you report a online safety case. And like Karuna mentioned, right, they must be empowered to play that role. It's not as simple as walk into a police station and get it registered, right? Then at the police station, there is no communication back to the platform. So sometimes the FIR is registered, but the content remains up. So the police's perspective is, let me catch the perpetrator, but the victim's urgent need is take the content down. And it's possible, but because of a missing link, that does not happen. Which hopefully, the new interventions may sort of succeed. Then I think finally you have to imagine that there is a social dimension. So just like there are for women and child cases, larger social dimensional issues of denigration. Sometimes if it's heavy doxing, you may need to have a safe space for a while. And these are bigger, longer term visions, but these are needs that do come up in cases, and I'm speaking on the basis of cases that we have received, right? So how do you cater for those in a social and welfare system, addressing this larger social vulnerability? And then of course, prevention of re-upload, which I think Stop NCII is doing a terrific job at. So I think, more sort of evolving that science further. So I think these are some of the issues that at a victim level, for them to enter a system, we need to have in place.
So I think, by these almost 25 minutes of discussion, to me, it doesn't seem more of a technological problem. It's more of a problem of governance, and the governance system which is revolving around us. In a way, how our society is functioning, how is the support system from the society, from the institutions, what are the mechanisms of complaint, how smooth it is, whether they are trained in. I want you, both of three of you, to kind of take a minute each, and what we can expect from on the governance side, particularly from the government, if we say, or the governance system, which is like our policymakers, not just companies, because we had always been saying, oh, companies could do this and that, but we ourselves are not as ready. What do you think? What could be a kind of it's not a one-line solution, but still, what is one thing which is on the top which we can expect from the policymakers? Anyone can begin.
I can jump in. I think, we've talked a lot about, the victim's experience and, how hard it is to navigate the situation when their image is shared. So I think the government has made some strides in the past few years with, the laws being introduced, with the SOP, with some guidance for tech companies on how they should respond if this harm is, they're made aware of this harm on their services. I think the big thing would be to get more clarity around some of those, interventions. So for example, we've heard about the image matching system, data bank, which is India is going to be setting up. Like, how is that going to really work? How is that going to work? Given some of these harms are transnational, they're not just in one country. They're sometimes the perpetrators in one part of the world or even one part of the country, and the victims in another. So just making sure that this is done at an international level and not just at an India level, so that it's feeding into structures like the NECMEC system or the Interpol system or the stopncii.org system for adults. So just making sure that that infrastructure is being respected. They're not recreating the wheel, and just looking at this harm at just the India perspective is something that I'm very keen to track and see. And then the other thing I think, which we've all talked about continuously, has been the victim-centric piece of it. So just making sure that whatever systems, whatever proposals are being put forward, are keeping the victim's needs at the center of the conversation. So a simple thing like even taking your photo to a law enforcement official or to someone, them looking at it and gawking at it, how do we make sure that they have the right to privacy, and that their dignity is protected through the entire process. So simple stuff like that. So I'll stop there with those two interventions.
Yeah.
Punjaji?
So shall I go in, or Smita, do you want to go first?
Carry on, carry on.
Okay. So I feel like number one, there needs to be like an investment in moderation. I think from the beginning of this year, or like I think sometime last year, like the moderation systems have been sort of like, like really devolved. Even if it like, like an exclusive channel, like a trusted partners where NGOs get to escalate, or regular moderation systems, we are seeing a devolution in like, just content coming up, reporting, and between reporting and this, for former lay citizens point, the time has increased, the quality of moderation has really gone down, right? And this is sort of like, why a lot of people are lashing out against platforms is also because of this. And that the volume has increased in the last 1 year. Then something like, like the grievance appellate committee and the grievance officer system was working. It was working very well with some platforms, and with some it was not working. So I feel like some level of transparency, like instead of making it just roundly stringent for everyone, I really feel the ones who are implementing it properly and in spirit, in a victim centric manner, they need to be said that okay, you're doing a good work, and the ones who are not doing it, which exactly led to this whole grok issue, and like with no backlash, right? And they are supposed to be like X is supposed to be, sorry to like call it out, but like X is really supposed to be a significant social media intermediary, but it does not behave like one. It does not behave even as good as a Telegram, where it is easier to actually take harmful content down once we have visibility on it. So, and how is it allowed to continue without anything? And then like if the rules are made stringent, it still doesn't apply to X, right? So I mean, like right now there is some sort of blocking happening which can be easily circumvented, but that victim wants the content down, right? So that aspect is not going through at all. So I feel like some auditing of these systems before calling for a complete overhaul. With there have been gains, so it is a matter of preserving some gains and then bringing in reform. So I think that is something that needs to be introduced, and I think very much second Karuna's thing on SOPs needed at police station as to how to collect digital evidence. Different states, different police stations have absolutely different ways in which evidence are collected. So we also don't know what to advise the victim as to like, how do you prepare yourself to walk in.
Thank you, Smitaji.
So walking into a police station in itself is quite intimidating, I would understand, for a victim who has gone through this. In terms of governance and the policy level, I would want to see more coordination, the hash bank and the hash matching. There are photo DNA techniques, whether it is being used, and how democratic are you making it to the civil society, to the subject matter expert, that this is how the government is going about this. Deploying crawlers, another very important aspect. Canada has deployed, there is Project Arachnid. Are we learning from the experiences of our international community and not just inventing the wheel? Having said that, while we understand and learn and adopt it to the Indian context, also promoting the accountability of the internet service providers as well as the industry, because we need to put people at the center rather than profits and power. Thank you.
Manish, sorry, and
Thank
before
you.
you jump in, I
Yeah,
think
please.
the one thing we haven't talked about is, the whole piece around stopping the content being shared in the first place, because everything we've talked about is when it's too late, like somebody has generated the content or shared the content. But like, at every level, right from governance to, the society, response to even things like tech response to actually making the perpetrators stop and reflect and not do what they were about to do. There's a lot more that can be done there. Be it from like, warning interstitials that you might get if you are trying to upload something, one of these things to one of the platforms to say, hey, what you're about to share may actually violate our policies and also be illegal where you're at. To, moral science education in classrooms. I don't know. But I think we've not talked about that huge chunk of work that needs to be done, because it's too late once the content is shared. We can pull back and we can minimize some of the backlash on the victim, but there is going to be the content is out there. So
I think
Yeah, actually, in that line of thought, preventing the cycle of harm through digital and online well-being for students, for peers, for safeguarding teams in schools are being implemented across the world and also in pockets in India. But how foolproof is it? How can we make it more context specific? And how can we really implement it to bring about that behavior change? Because once the image is out, yes, we are just doing the correction. But can we do something to prevent the cycle of harm? Yes, of course we can do. That is called digital well-being and online safeguarding. That is something which must be regularized and more streamlined throughout all kinds of educational institutions and community-based organizations. Thank you.
Yeah, and like at the trust line, sort of just to add to this, at the trust line, like our counselors always want that there should be a lesson taught in communities to boys as to how to handle a breakup. And I think, like, but it's really true. Like, it would, like, I think and I'm not like placing myself out of blame here, but I really feel if boys were taught how to break up in a non-toxic manner, that would significantly reduce the number of the case burden on our helpline. Many of the cases form of in partner violence of very sort of like younger, like, like not adolescents, but like younger adults who are going through breakup, who have a lot of content of each other, and then it sort of release. And as Karuna mentioned, once it is released, it goes into a secondary market, But at the point of release, it's always this sort of relationship abuse, that dynamic.
I think that is a big challenge because I sometimes feel like, as a society, we have not been taught how to use phones, how to use technology. And it is very difficult even in like, our schools. So what I'm saying is that, we have not been taught as a society in schools, like phones and everything have come so fast that the system has not been able to pick up on it. That is a major issue. There is no about teaching about hygiene on the digital platforms which is being taught in schools. And there is no institution, whether it's a state, it's the religion, it's society, nobody is talking about it. Nobody is giving an opportunity there. And that is a very, very significant space because a lot of our behavior will pick up from there.
So I think,
Can you
Manish,
guys
actually,
hear me?
we can. And Manish, you and Smita have talked about, online safety education, digital well-being. And I think Sid and I are more of the camp that this is actually more value education and more around consent and more around the, basic, when someone breaks up with you, like it's their choice, like you cannot retaliate, like, it's not okay for you to still share something that was shared in a trusted moment in your relationship. So I think in addition to the, digital, online well-being and the, tech, aspect of it, I think having just basic consent education, and this may come down to moral science or value classes that we used to have in school when I was a kid, or it may come down to sex ed classes when in the middle, which were piloted in some places. It could be either of those, but I'm not sure if the digital online safety training is going to be the silver bullet for this. I think it might have to be a combination of all these three things, because tech is just one avenue of that harm. That person is probably perpetrating other harms in the offline environment too, to harass that victim, and the online sharing of images is just one component of that abuse.
Yeah, the only thing is that that component has now become, has got a lot of ability to make it bigger. That is one of the biggest threats. And it lives much more because, otherwise the social memory is not really so long. So that is one thing. But thank you so much, all of you, for this thing. And before we close, I want to announce that, we are soon launching a public survey on NCII in India, which would be aimed to capturing lived experiences, public perception, and the broader reality surrounding image-based abuse and emerging digital harms in today's ecosystem, online ecosystem. We will be sharing the details of the survey very soon, and we sincerely hope that people will participate, share it widely, and continue this conversation with us beyond today's discussion. I would requesting your help also, and we would like to bring the results of this survey in the report, which we will be doing in another probably 3 months at the most. Once again, thank you so much.